Thank you for the floor, Emese. If everyone is ready to start, then we would like to proceed with the second panel. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second panel discussion of the conference, ASEAN's role in global politics, perception, strategies, and prospects. My name is Tamás, and I'm head of department I'm head of the Asian and African Relations Department at Antall József Knowledge Centre, and this is my utmost pleasure to fulfill the role of the moderator of the second panel of today. The title of the upcoming panel discussion is the ASEAN +3 and its implications for the European Union. The ASEAN +3 cooperation itself, involving the 10 ASEAN member states along with China, Republic of Korea and Japan, itself brings forward a lot of topics to be discussed, including economy, security and politics. But what is more important that today we will assess these issues in connections with the group's relations with the European Union. And we will analyze the realities of EU-ASEAN cooperation and identify the areas where the interactions of the two integrations are the most relevant. Please let me introduce you our distinguished speakers of the second panel. First of all, please let me welcome Mr. Xavier NUTTIN, who has devoted most of his career to developing relations between EU and Asia. He has a wide experience of the Asian continent, of its policies and of its cultural aspects, acquired since 1978 during 3 postings in ASEAN countries. He is currently Senior Associate and member of the Advisory Board of the European Institute for Asian Studies, an independent think tank in Brussels, and a co-organizer for today's event. Xavier was from June 2005 to March 2018 a senior Asia analyst in the policy unit of the Directorate General for External Affairs of the European Parliament. His main responsibilities were to provide for the parliamentary bodies tailor-made analysis of Asian countries and to advise on the political aspects of EU-Asia relations. He was an official of the European Commission from 1993 to 2005, working on the development cooperation in the Asia Directorate. He was successively posted at the European Commission headquarters in Brussels and to the European Commission's delegation to Thailand and then to the European Commission's delegation to Vietnam. In the late 70s, early 80s, he was based in Bangkok working on education and health programs in several countries in Asia for UNESCO, UNICEF and the World Bank. Now, let me please introduce you our next speaker of the panel, Dr. Rahul MISHRA. Rahul, welcome to the panel discussion. Dr. Rahul MISHRA is a senior lecturer at the Asia-Europe Institute, University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Prior to this, he was a consultant with the Foreign Service Institute, Ministry of External Affairs, the Government of India. At the Institute, his primary responsibilities were to coordinate training modules for visiting foreign diplomats and give lectures on Asian security and Southeast Asian issues. Before joining the FSI, Dr. MISHRA worked with the Indian Council of World Affairs in New Delhi as a research fellow for more than 4 years. Recipient of the Asia Fellowship of the East-West Center in Washington and the Korean Government Fellowship, Dr. MISHRA worked as a researcher at IDSA in New Delhi for 4 years. In 2012 and 2013, Dr. MISHRA was a visiting research fellow at Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Prior to that, he was affiliated with National University of Singapore. He was awarded the National Research Fellowship of the University Grants Commission, the Government of India, and to pursue research in international relations. He earned his doctorate from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. He specializes on the ASEAN regionalism, comparative regionalism, political security affairs on the Southeast Asian region, and the role of major and middle powers in the Indo-Pacific region, especially in the context of the rise of China. And I would like to also invite Professor David Camroux to join our panel discussion. Mr. Camroux was also part of the first panel discussion, and we welcome him to join as a commentator, and we will be glad to have his views also on these questions. I would like to now start the discussion with the first question, which will be about the achievements of the EU-ASEAN relations so far. So we can see that the partnership between the EU and ASEAN has a history of more than 4 decades, and over these years the cooperation has expanded and deepened among the two parties and has been involving a wide spectrum of areas. So first of all, I would like to ask you to give a general evaluation of the results of this partnership. In your view, what are the greatest achievements of the EU-ASEAN cooperation so far? And also, just a technicality, please, any one of you are welcome to answer all the questions. So these are not directed to one single person, but rather for a material to be discussed to all of you. Mr. NUTTIN, could you please start?
Thank you very much, and hello to everyone, and thank you for inviting me to join this discussion on ASEAN-EU relations. Of course, your first question on the achievements in EU-ASEAN relation is very large and very difficult to answer because, as you mentioned, relations started more than 40 years ago in 1977, and both sides, the EU and ASEAN, have changed a lot since that time through enlargements, integration policies, economic growth. The two blocks are very different from what they were in early 80s, and the relationship between the two sides is still formally based on the 1980 cooperation agreement. As you said, cooperation has developed in many different fields. You can imagine almost everything, and we know that ASEAN is based on 3 pillars. And of course, cooperation has developed very much along those 3 pillars, but also in the last EU communication on ASEAN, the 2015 communication, 3 priority areas have been defined. One is connectivity, and we know that for ASEAN, connectivity is very important. The second one is environment and natural resources, and the third one is political and security issues. This is seen from the EU side priority in the 2015 communication. Now, achievements, there's no doubt that the deepest and most dynamic cooperation is in trade and investment. Today, we know that ASEAN is the EU's 3rd largest trade partner, while the EU is ASEAN's 2nd trade partner. So it's a very, very important relationship, and certainly for many people, the biggest achievement of the EU-ASEAN relation or cooperation will be in trade, because trade has increased many, many times since the start of the relationship. I would say that in one sense, it's also the biggest failure, because negotiations for a region-to-region FTA have been suspended since more than 10 years, since 2009. The two sides have not managed to negotiate a bilateral region-to-region free trade agreement. So in that sense, it's not a very big success, although we all agree that the volume of the exchanges have increased. So from my point of view, and even if that may seem a little bit surprising, one of the biggest achievements of the bilateral relation between ASEAN and the EU is the EU participation in security and defense cooperation activities. Why? Because the EU certainly is not a very strong military player. It has no military presence in the region. It has a very weak CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy. And still, it has managed since the early 2000s, and certainly in recent years, to join many activities and to engage with ASEAN on security and defense matters, being at the ASEAN Regional Forum, being at CISCAP, being in chairing or organizing workshops. Quite surprisingly, the EU, not being a military power, managed to be part of security and defense activities. Of course, it is mostly on non-traditional security issues because one has to be realistic, but very important for the EU that wants to be a global player to also be involved in security and defense matters. A second achievement, which I thought is very important from the EU point of view, is the support to the ASEAN institutions that are instrumental in supporting ASEAN regional integration. We know that the EU is a big supporter of regional integration worldwide, and therefore the EU has managed to really support, and is the biggest financial support to the ASEAN Secretariat and to most of the ASEAN regional integration. And that includes the establishment in 2015 of a region-to-region policy dialogue on human rights. So I would say that a lot of achievements. The most obvious one will be on trade, but the cooperation on political and security matters and the support to regional integration institution in ASEAN are very, very big results from the EU.
Thank you very much for your very complex assessment. Now I would like to ask Dr. MISHRA to comment and to share his views on the achievements existing so far between the EU-Asia relations among these.
Well, I think key points have already been made, but let us take a long view of international relations and history. And there, I think there are certain factors which need to be highlighted. The first is considering the history of Europe's relations with Southeast Asia, the ASEAN region as it is called today. I think the biggest achievement is that we've been able to let the bitterness go away. If you compare European Union's current state of relations with ASEAN countries, there is no negative element in it. And if you compare it with other major powers, China, for example, China has not been able to get out of that negative impression that it had during the Cold War years and even before with the Southeast Asian countries. So that is number one. Second, if you look at it, by way of comparison, if you look at other countries, Russia, for example, is still struggling with it. The US, after the Vietnam War, it took US roughly 50 years to normalize relations with Indonesia. So I think in that context, letting this bitterness go away between major European countries and ASEAN region is first biggest achievement, I would say. The second is that European Union as a regional grouping has contributed to the prosperity of ASEAN. And that is something very significant for ASEAN as a region, because remember, ASEAN as a regional grouping was established for economic, socio-cultural reasons. So in that sense, the fact, as my co-panelist has already highlighted, the fact that European Union is one of the top contributors in terms of foreign direct investment, and also in terms of total bilateral trade, is a significant thing. $280 billion trade is I think it's a big achievement. Also, even though the FTA arrangement has been stalled and negotiations are still going on, I think this is a big achievement, because in comparison to other major powers, in comparison to other dialogue partners, except China through the way of through the RCEP, no other country has been able to bring two regions together, So it's not that India, for example, is not working on a South Asia SAARC ASEAN FTA, or Russia is not working on EEC or SCO, you name it. There are so many regional mechanisms. Is not working on something like that. Even with the US, Trans-Pacific Partnership was only with the 3-4 Southeast Asian countries. So region to region trade arrangement is something that European Union is offering, even though it is stalled at this moment. When it materializes, it would be a massive achievement for these two regions. And I think most important of all, when ASEAN started as a regional group in 1967, it did not have European Union as the role model. The speeches that Rajaratnam had given or Tunku Abdul Rahman had given at that time was that, look, we are a group of Southeast Asian countries. We do not want to involve in power politics. We'll focus on dealing with our collective common challenges collectively, and in that process, we'll also try to deal with our economic problems and socio-cultural issues. But over past 4 decades, what has happened is ASEAN has started following the European Union model. And I think that's also one of the biggest contributions of the European Union. In that context, though, it's not a one-way traffic of learning. ASEAN has also offered some lessons that European Union can perhaps learn. And one of that is that if you compare ASEAN with European Union, ASEAN has been a success in engaging a post-communist, engaging a communist state, which was an adversary during the Cold War years, that is Vietnam. And Vietnam today is one of the most proactive members of the ASEAN. Whereas in case of European Union, Soviet Union was an adversary, and Russia even today is an adversary. So there, I think perhaps European Union could learn a lesson or two on how to mitigate differences and how to talk about issues of mutual concern. I understand that this is not going to be very easy for European Union because Russia has its own grand strategy and designs vis-a-vis the European region. But perhaps this is one of the cues that maybe European Union can take from ASEAN.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would like to ask if Dr. Camroux has a comment on this.
Thanks for allowing me a second bite at the cake, so to speak. I'm sorry to abuse my time. I've been conducting research within a European Union-funded Horizon 2020 project on regional integration in Southeast Asia. And I've been going around ASEAN capitals, simply asking the question, what are the costs and benefits of membership of ASEAN for your country? I asked it in foreign ministries and think tanks and others. And my ASEAN friends or the people I interview are somewhat surprised at the idea that there may be costs, actually. There seems to be only benefits for being a member of ASEAN. In a paper which should be published shortly, I argued there that actually membership of ASEAN serves 6 purposes. So allow me to be a little bit professorial and say what I think those six purposes are. The first is that ASEAN is an enhancer, enhances the sovereignty of the individual member states. It doesn't detract from their sovereignty, in fact, enhances their sovereignty. So the second thing I suggest is that ASEAN legitimizes different governments in ASEAN. Like all regional organizations or international organizations, what ASEAN does is to strengthen the power of executives, not of other parts of government, but of executives. So we can see in the case of Myanmar's membership, of Vietnam's membership, joining ASEAN, kind of gave further legitimacy to the civilian government that came into power, or initially the military government in Myanmar and later the civilian government, and the case of Vietnam. The third thing I argue is that ASEAN is a kind of socializer, that it allows a social interaction between the political leaderships of the member states. I think there's nothing terribly controversial about that. The fourth thing is that ASEAN provides a shield or a buffer for criticism. Since Myanmar has joined ASEAN, criticism of its treatment of the Rohingya of the other member states has been subdued. And ASEAN itself provides a buffer for internal criticism of certain forms of behavior of individual member states. The fifth thing is that ASEAN provides a way of hedging against extra-regional power, something we talked about in the first panel, that membership of ASEAN, we can see this in relation to China and the US, that imposing ASEAN centrality is a way of sort of hedging and balancing in relation to external great powers. And the final thing is that ASEAN is a fantastic lever for getting money, for getting funding. I mean, the figures, the ASEAN Secretariat is financed, I've seen various figures, but at least by 2/3, 70%, up to some other figures I've gone to 95%, 96% by third parties, by the European Union, by individual European countries like Germany, by countries like the United States, Australia, and others. This is a fantastic deal. You've got a club and others are paying your club membership. Well, I mean, God, I wish we could do that in the European Union rather than having 1% of our GDP. I don't want what. But in the European Union, if we didn't have to pay our 1% of our GDP or 1.1% of our GDP as the membership fee, so to speak, I think there would be some Eurosceptics who would be very, very happy. So I think we need to keep in mind what are the benefits of membership of ASEAN, because this comes into play. And I let Xavier NUTTIN talk about this because he's the real expert on the subject in terms of, ASEAN's interrelations or inter-regional relations with the world's most structured regional entity, which is the European Union.
Thank you very much, Dr. Camroux. You made a very good summary of assessing these 6 features of the internal dynamics of ASEAN. And I was wondering on formulating the next question with regard to these dynamics within regional integrations. And my question would be, well, we can see that both the ASEAN and the EU are itself representing forms of regional integration and multilateralism. And my question would be, according to you, can multilateralism exceed the importance of bilateral ties between the individual member states of the 2 blocs when it comes to EU and ASEAN relations? It is more bilateral between individual countries, or the 2 big frameworks are working together? How do you see this?
Perhaps I should let Xavier answer. I'll just say briefly that the genius of ASEAN, of the ASEAN members, is that they balance the 2. I mean, there are privileged relations, for example, between Vietnam and France, the legacy of the colonial past, so to speak. And there are privileged relations, for example, between Vietnam and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, like Hungary. Hungary is one of the beneficiaries, and Vietnam is one of the beneficiaries of those long-standing ties, predating the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But I'll let Xavier go on more fully, I think, on the subject.
Yes, thank you. And thank you also, David, for presenting the 6 benefits of ASEAN, which most of them are not very positive with regard to regional integration, but it's a reality, that we have to live with. And as you said, the EU and ASEAN are totally different type of animals, and we should not try too much to compare them. When it comes to the question, of course, the engagement can take place at different levels. I mean, 3 different levels. One is between the member states, the EU member states and the ASEAN member states. Another one is between the 2 regions, between EU and ASEAN. But the third one is also in multilateral fora, like ASEM or WTO, where the EU and ASEAN can work together to achieve results. So there are different levels, and I don't think we should put them into competition. They can really coexist. And of course, also, as David just mentioned, most ASEAN member states have a special relationship with some EU member states for historical or colonial reasons. Singapore, Myanmar, Malaysia have a closer relations with the UK. And when you are in Singapore and you read the press, if they talk about the EU, it's through the British press. It's not the EU, it's the UK. France, Laos, Cambodia have a closer relationship. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia have a closer relationship with France for historical reason. But Germany also, there were a lot of Vietnamese who went to East Germany for their training. So they have close historical relations that go well beyond trade relation. It covers culture, food, language, tourism, travel. While on the other hand, the EU is mostly seen as a trade bloc in Southeast Asia. If you talk to the people, and there have been some studies made on that, the EU is seen as a trade bloc, as an economic power. And on the other hand, ASEAN integration is still very weak. We don't hear about an ASEAN identity. People in ASEAN don't feel ASEAN. Most of them, they are Indonesians or they are Thai, but the identity of ASEAN is really not very well developed. And of course, the EU member states do not hesitate to play their own card when they think it's in their own interest, which is okay also, because as I said, there's no need to compete between the different levels. So to be clear in answering your question, if the multilateral level will supersede the national level, no, I don't think so. Not for the moment, not yet. Certainly not before ASEAN integration progress and becomes deeper, and certainly not when the 2 blocs, and certainly EU, can be seen as different from being only a trade bloc. This is my view for the moment, but things can change in the next few years, of course.
If I could just add,
Sure.
If I could just add something, one of the elements of EU-ASEAN relations is the role of diasporas. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Yep. And I've been to Brussels several times for meetings on the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. And these were organized by a Czech MEP in the European Parliament. And I pursued this, and I discovered that the Czech Republic has the largest Vietnamese diaspora in proportion to its population in the world. Okay. And as Xavier just said about Germany, the number of Vietnamese trained in Germany, and they're also the Viet Kieu community in Germany, play a role in these EU-ASEAN relations. You know, social actors, you know, non-governmental actors are also important elements in this relationship.
Dr. MISHRA, how do you see this situation?
Well, before I comment on that, I think I'd just like to say a couple of things. One is that when we look at the European Union, when we start praising European Union, we somehow tend to overlook the fact that one, there is a difference between regionalism and regionalization. Creating an European identity is part of the larger regionalization project. It's a bottom-up approach, and European Union has got a common cohesive identity for a number of factors. Religion is just one of that. Common historical background is another one. In case of ASEAN region, things are different. There are different religions, there are different ethnic identities. Of course, these countries are very assertive about their sovereignty because of the colonial experience. But all these factors have to be really taken into consideration when we talk about identity. But that was not the question. The question was multilateralism, whether multilateralism can exceed bilateral relations. My simple and straight answer would be as long as you have major powers in any part of the world, bilateralism cannot really be superseded or exceeded by multilateralism. Major powers by design want to and tend to deal with countries bilaterally. So that is one aspect which we have to keep in mind. And for ASEAN countries, they don't have the luxury to choose. They, of course, as much as they want to promote ASEAN as the only platform, that is not a possibility always. Look at the European Union ASEAN FTA, for example. European Union, let's be fair about how they dealt with it. They really wanted to promote the inter-regional economic cooperation FTA. That did not materialize, that's fair enough. But at this moment, European Union is getting into FTA arrangements with Singapore. It has already signed one. It has also signed another one with Vietnam. And for somebody who promotes ASEAN regionalism, this is not in the spirit of ASEAN regional integration, right? If you want to go ahead with inter-regional cooperation, if you respect ASEAN as a region, you have to perhaps wait a little longer, maybe dilute the FTA arrangements, maybe have it more multi-layered as it is happening in case of RCEP, but do not take the bilateral route, which is ASEAN as one unit and dealing with another country as another one. And here I think it would be fair to give the 16 plus 1 or 17 plus 1 as an example. European Union gets furious when China deals with a section or certain number of countries within the European Union on trade, investment, and political cooperation issues, and says that China is actually harming the European identity and European regional integration. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we look at inter-regional cooperation or when we deal with ASEAN as a region, we have to sort of understand that regional identity is something that should be respected. We respect that in case of European Union, and that should be respected in case of ASEAN as well. But that, of course, is not the reality. Reality is that countries want to maximize their gains, and that's why they want to deal with other countries bilaterally. Also, I just wanted to comment on this point about Britain being very influential in Singapore, even in Malaysia, because of colonial experience. Well, that is, I would say that is true only in the case of media. You talk to businessmen in Malaysia and Singapore, they can talk all day long about Germany or maybe Italy. Britain used to be one of the top investors during the 60s and 70s, and that was one of the reasons why it was very influential in both Singapore and Malaysia. But that is not a reality today. Controlling the media, influencing the media, of course, is one big asset of the United Kingdom, even today. And that is why we see a lot of reports and, citing, quoting sources from the British newspapers and BBC, etc. But that does not reflect the reality on the ground.
If I may just trace more quick reaction first on ASEAN identity. Of course, I understand what you say, and as I said before, ASEAN does not need to be like the EU, so there is no push for that. I was just mentioning that the fact that there is no ASEAN identity makes it difficult to have this multilateral relation between ASEAN and the EU. On the FTA, well, the region-to-region FTA is the first choice for the EU. It's not that the EU does not want to have a bloc-to-bloc FTA. On the contrary, this has always been the first choice, and is still the first choice. there are many, many reasons why it could not take place 10 years ago, or why the negotiation have been suspended. But it's not against the objective of the EU. The EU will jump on it as soon as it can. And then on the last point on the influence of the UK or not in Singapore or Malaysia, well, I'm afraid that you're talking through the prism of the business. I'm not talking about through the prism or through the eyes of business. I'm talking through the eyes of society. And when I live in Singapore at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, everything I saw, all the people with whom I discussed, all they knew about the EU was about through the UK or about the UK. And very few people knew something else apart from tourism, if they'd been traveling. And of course, some business people want to do business with Germany. But I don't think we should reduce the EU or ASEAN to purely trade matters or a business aspect. It's much wider than that.
If I can just respond, I think I did say that for European Union, dealing with ASEAN as a regional, as a unit that is inter-regional FTA is the first choice. So I think I did mention that. And if you slipped it, I think I'm sorry about that. The second is, yes, Britain, the British media is very powerful. Its impact is very much there. And that also goes on to verify the Gramscian idea that if you control the intellectual space, you be, of course, in the mainstream all the time. But just a tiny question: what would happen to European identity after Brexit? And Britain has already started showing signs of having its own identity. So what would happen to the European Union then? Because media, etc., is already not controlled, but massively influenced by the British in Malaysia and Singapore, to a certain extent, in Myanmar as well.
Well, that may be a good opportunity for the media in Singapore or Malaysia to look at the EU through the other member states' press or to their contacts in the EU, because Great Britain will not be part of the EU anymore. I suppose there will be less reason to look at the UK to talk about the EU. On the other hand, there is a big risk that if they keep looking only at the British press, what will be in the British press will be even more negative about the EU, because there will be big competition or disputes between the EU and the UK, but only the future will tell us.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to switch to our next question, which was partly already touched by Mr. NUTTIN. It's about the level of interactions. So he mentioned about, for instance, the Asia-Europe meeting. And my question relates to this. So when it comes to the relations between the EU and ASEAN, we can see that there are a number of different partnerships, initiatives, and strategies which exist in parallel. There is a partnership between ASEAN and the European Union. And last year, the parties agreed in principle to upgrade this relationship to be a strategic one. But there is also an EU-Asia connectivity strategy adopted in 2018. Also, there is another cooperation format which has been mentioned. It's the Asia-Europe meeting, which is again another level. And of course, this list is not exhaustive. And my question is, how can actors ensure that synergies are created among these cooperation structures and they are not harming each other's effectiveness? How do you see this?
Well, yes, indeed, you're very right that there are many different proposals, strategies, groupings. Many analysts speak when they were talking about mostly about FTAs, but more in general about a spaghetti bowl or noodle bowl of different agreements and papers. And of course, this is the way it is, and many different sectors are important. One solution will be to concentrate on a limited number of activities or areas of cooperation, and to be more efficient, to put more resources on those areas. But then how do you select those areas? Because the EU as a global power and a global player has to be involved in all the different sectors. It cannot just choose and pick, or pick and choose. I never know how to use to say pick and choose, where it will collaborate or cooperate. And of course, ASEAN may have different views or different priorities. So I think it's only inevitable to have different strategies. What is important for me, at least from the part of the EU and certainly from the part of ASEAN as well, is to have a vision. If the EU knows where it wants to go, what is the long-term vision, then all those different strategies may fit into a more coherent framework. But of course, if there is no global vision, if it is only to answer to immediate needs or to react, many people say that the EU-Asia connectivity strategy is just a reaction to the Belt and Road Initiative. So if it is only a reaction, it means it's not part of a long-term vision, and therefore you may have problems to coordinate and to cooperate the different structure, and to have competition or to divert resources from one to the other. For me, the real issue is not to have many different structure or strategies, but is to have the vision that will underpin all those different strategies.
Thank you. Dr. Mishra, how do you see this question?
I think, well, multiple channels of communication are good. I would say that they only enhance your communication. And these overlaps are natural. Like even within the ASEAN mechanism, there is one ADMM Plus, which involves the ASEAN member states and key dialogue partners. Then you have the ASEAN Regional Forum. Then you have the East Asia Summit. So the agenda that is set is almost the same. It's just the level of participation changes. Between ADMM Plus and ARF, you have the membership scope increasing. Between ADMM Plus and East Asia Summit, is of course all the heads of states, government, and ADMM is ministers level. So I think multiple channels of communication with different actors within from a particular government is, I'm okay with that. ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting is a completely different animal because it has 55, 56 members, right? And it is about Asia-Europe coming together. It's not just about ASEAN. So Asia-Europe meeting, I think, should be strengthened further. And that would perhaps contribute to Europe playing, or European Union playing, a more important role in the Asian power politics or economic order, or whatever you want to call it. But in the Asian dynamism, the involvement of European Union can be ensured if we have a more agenda-driven and specific agenda-driven Asia-Europe meeting. So that is my short answer to that.
Yes,
if I may just add on ASEM, I fully agree with you that ASEM is totally different. ASEM is an informal process. From the start in '96 in Bangkok, it was designed as an informal process, which means there is no commitment, there is no real, there's certainly no binding decisions taken during the ASEM summit. There are many meetings, but it's an informal process between Asia and Europe. It's so huge, as you said, 51 countries, that it's difficult to find common ground. So it can only be a place to exchange, which is very important, but it's not cannot act at the same level as EU and ASEAN that can have binding agreements or strategies that will commit both sides to implement activities.
Exactly, because of this very amorphous, vague agenda, are having a very informal process, we've not been able to achieve much. And my personal experience is that my institute, the Asia Europe Institute in University of Malaya, was set up as a part of the ASEAN process. But because meetings are informal, there are no follow-ups, and there's no established mechanism. Even national governments do not focus much on the agenda, even on the higher education. So initially, back in 1996, when Dr. Mahathir, during his previous term, had promised to turn this institute into a full-fledged university. But the money never came because of obvious reasons. Nobody talks about it, and it's just an informal process. So you can promise anything and get away with it.
Yes, I can see. And Dr. Camroux, would you like to comment on this issue?
In practice, the Asia-Europe meetings, now that it's become so large, it's virtually a third of the United Nations, or maybe even half of, I don't know, a third of the United Nations population terms, is that it becomes an occasion for the bilateral meeting. So basically what's interesting in the official ASEAN meetings is the bilaterals that occur, the EU-Japan, the EU-China, and the EU-ASEAN meetings. I don't think one should put much stock in, the possibilities with ASEAN as such. The EU-ASEAN meeting has a real sense, and it is, 37 countries, and it can be more focused, and it fits into the agenda of the European Union in encouraging interregionalism and encouraging regional integration in other parts of the world, not just in ASEAN, but in Mercosur, in Africa, and elsewhere. It's very important for the EU to promote its as one of its export products, its model or a model of regional integration. I agree with Xavier that the EU is not a model. I think it is a kind of a reference point in talking about regional integration, because it helps us to focus on various things like institutionalization and representativity and those kinds of things. But the challenge is to balance the EU-ASEAN relations with the EU's relations with individual ASEAN members, and to set priorities. Myanmar is a priority for the EU, and so it should be, encouraging a very difficult democratic transition in Myanmar is something that I think should be prioritized by the EU. So I think it also means making choices of what can be done, what can be done effectively, and then concentrating perhaps on those choices, which may mean not being able to do everything with all of the ASEAN members. And I must add, I think that relations with Indonesia need to be treated in their own right. Indonesia has chosen to tie its foreign relations in talking about ASEAN centrality. But we are talking about the world's third largest democracy, the world's largest Muslim country. And I think if there's another priority, it should be those economic relations with an Indonesia which has undergone an extraordinary process of democratization, of decentralization, with ups and downs since the fall of the Suharto regime in 1998. So it's a question of also the EU's, to use the language of Ian Manners, promoting its norms and its values, which means maybe also concentrating on individual ASEAN member states.
Yes, thank you so much. So my next question would be about the importance of connectivity, which is a term that we used to hear a lot of times in the past 10 years, and which is actually a quite new term, but we hear it more and more frequently. And when it comes to connectivity, I also want to connect China to this question. So China has its own ambitions under the flag of connectivity and the Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time, we have to see that China is also part of the ASEAN +3 cooperation. So it is one of the +3, actually. So besides this, we have to see that the ASEAN has its own understanding of connectivity, and it has released earlier a master plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025. And in light of this, what do you think? How can China and its Belt and Road Initiative impact the cooperation between EU and ASEAN?
Well, here I think you have been talking a little bit about this already in the first panel, where the importance of China for ASEAN was discussed during the first panel. Certainly, we see that China is becoming more assertive in the region and in the world, and it's launching those initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, but also other ones to increase its geopolitical clout. And from my point of view, and I don't think I'm the only one, to challenge ASEAN centrality and to become the regional power. And of course, the fact that the US becomes more isolationist opens the door for China to, and offers opportunities to China to fill this vacuum. We will see after the next US election if the situation changes or not. But the reality, and I think this was also said in the first panel, is that China is the first or the second trade partner for all ASEAN member states and invests a lot in badly needed infrastructure. So clearly the ASEAN countries and ASEAN cannot take a hard line against China. They cannot afford to take a hard line because China is the neighbor and because it's the largest trade partner and investor. Because it would be very counterproductive for ASEAN to become too antagonist with China. And we see with the South China Sea that the ASEAN answer or response is always very weak and inconsistent because it's very difficult to to define a strong line. So the reality is China is there. China BRI will influence on the different countries. It was also mentioned that in some of the member states like Myanmar or Malaysia, there have been second thoughts about project included in the Belt and Road Initiative, and or at least renegotiations of the terms of the project, which is a good thing. But the BRI is there, and it is the flagship project of Xi Jinping, included in the Chinese constitution, and therefore it will not go away. So it will have an influence. The worst of the worst, and I think David mentioned it also in the first panel, is that if ASEAN would have to choose between China and the US, and it would be terrible for the EU as well, because we talk about ASEAN having to choose, but does the EU have to choose? Because it's also pulled between two sides, not exactly in the same position of ASEAN, and clearly there are more links and more relations with the US, but still the EU should be careful not being pushed into a direction where it has to choose a side. How could ASEAN avoid choosing? Well, for me, they need to deepen their integration because the only way they can maybe resist China is to be stronger as a bloc, as a group, not as individual member states, just like the EU. I mean, an individual member states in the EU cannot play a meaningful role on the global scene. ASEAN, same. They need to be stronger as a regional group, so they need to integrate better. They need to have stronger integration, to have stronger institutions, to assert themselves politically and economically in the region. Because if ASEAN loses its centrality into the regional architecture, it's extremely damageable for them, because for the moment, it is their contribution to stability and prosperity in the region. So as the EU, I think, should really continue and increase its support to ASEAN integration to make it stronger. As I said before, the EU believes strongly and support regional integration worldwide because we are convinced that regional integration is the best solution. So EU should really increase its support to ASEAN and make ASEAN stronger to balance the power of China.
Dr. MISHRA, what is your take on this question?
Well, if you look at the Chinese investment, the Belt and Road investments in individual Southeast Asian countries, I think it has been a mixed bag. There are countries which have benefited from it. There are countries which are not sure which direction they are going. Malaysia is I think the best example in that regard. So in the Malaysian government insisted on revising the terms of reference in terms of investment and was a success. But there have been protests also. Myanmar, there is, I think, the most prominent example, the Mitson Dam or Lat Patang mines. There have been a lot of troubles for the Chinese in Myanmar. Also, with regard to Indonesia, the situation has not been that smooth. And I don't think it is going to get any smoother in future as well. I agree with the point that BRI is a threat to ASEAN centrality for the simple reason that the Belt and Road Initiative is a unilateral, single country driven agenda, and it does not fit into the scheme or spirit of regionalism. It is not a consultative mechanism. One country, just Beijing deciding as to where the investment should be, what should be the scale and the amount of investment is not in sync with the ASEAN mechanism. The second is that through its investments, China has also been systematically damaging ASEAN structures. And one of that is the Mekong Cooperation. The alternative that China has created is Lanchang Mekong Cooperation. And that is a China-driven initiative. So sub-regional groupings within the ASEAN mechanism are already facing these direct attacks. And countries such as Vietnam have already protested against these. So we have to keep that in mind. But if you look at the dialogue partner, ASEAN's dialogue partners are major powers, it's a blessing in disguise. Because before 2013, before China's Belt and Road Initiative coming at such large scale and with such huge agenda, no major power was interested in this kind of systematic investment in the Southeast Asian region or elsewhere in the world. Today, you have all major stakeholders in ASEAN, whether it is the US or Japan, South Korea, or even Taiwan, India. All these countries have their own policies or plans of investment. Japan has Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, but Japan has been, I think, arguably the oldest player in infrastructure diplomacy. But if you look at the EU's connectivity plan, it's a good thing. I think it's a very beneficial thing with for the ASEAN countries. And I agree with David's point that ASEAN is one club that benefits a lot because of the rivalries that major powers have with one another. And EU's plan on connectivity is a very good example of that. Now, why would EU respond to China's Belt and Road is not because European Union wants to extract gains out of this investment scheme or wants to have more trade relation. It is because the attempt, whether it is the US or European Union, is to protect, first, they maintain the status quo, maintain the strategic equilibrium. And to do that, you have to keep on harping on ideas of rules-based, open, transparent investments, multilateral mechanisms, mutually agreeable consultations, and so on and so forth. So I think EU's plan should also be linked with its attempt and its desire to maintain the strategic equilibrium, the international liberal order. And on that point, I think it is very much in line with the American or Japanese or other proposals on connectivity and investment.
Yes. Dr. Camroux, what is your take on this question?
There is the challenge previously has been in the challenge in EU-ASEAN relations has been about ASEAN centrality in a region called the Asia-Pacific, dating back to the creation of something called APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, in the late 90s. Today, the challenge is EU-ASEAN relations and ASEAN centrality in the context of a new regional entity called the Indo-Pacific. This is a concept which was initially promoted by the Australians dating in 2013, and then the Indonesians at the same time, actually, and later by Japan and the United States. So an Indo-Pacific, of course, is a larger Asia in which India is a central player. So the challenge today for ASEAN, for the EU in relation to ASEAN, is how do we fit this particular relationship in the larger context of relations with something called the Indo-Pacific. Just 2 weeks ago, the German Foreign Ministry published its Asia policy document or perspective document for the years to come, and used the term Indo-Pacific for the first time. Actually, the term Indo-Pacific is a German one dating from the first part of the 20th century. But you know, this is not neutral, this term Indo-Pacific. It was certainly used a lot by the French, by President Macron, as part of legitimizing France's role in the South Pacific with New Caledonia and Polynesia, and also in the Indian Ocean with Reunion Island, so making France an Indo-Pacific power, so to speak. But it is also about situating EU-ASEAN relations in larger regional context, in larger global context, in which, you know, the elephant in the China shop, so to speak, or the China in the elephant shop, depending on how you want to put it, is present. It's, you know, the notion of Indo-Pacific as promoted by Donald Trump is clearly an attempt to contain China. Now, this is something that the EU doesn't want to do, and something certainly that ASEAN doesn't want to do. But it is now beholden on the European Union more widely now with this development in Germany. We now have the two major military powers in Europe on the same wavelength on the Indo-Pacific. The Brits were already to some extent on that same wavelength. And ASEAN also, the Indonesians are very cleverly, and Indonesian diplomacy is something that is often undervalued, the sophistication of Indonesian diplomacy. Last year, they got ASEAN to agree on something called an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific in order to maintain ASEAN's centrality in this larger regional entity called the Indo-Pacific. Now, just one point about ASEAN centrality. The notion of ASEAN centrality is relatively recent. It actually dates in official documents to 2006. Prior to that, we have expressions like ASEAN in the driver's seat. But ASEAN centrality as a kind of trope about ASEAN is, you know, less than 16 years old as a concept. But it's something that's very convenient for us all to encourage, because it makes things easier in our relations with Southeast Asian countries to deal with them as a regional entity. It's a question of convenience, and also with a certain number of benefits to be had from doing so. So this is, at the moment, the challenge, EU-ASEAN relations in the Indo-Pacific context.
So the last question would be about the future outlooks of the EU-ASEAN cooperation. So according to your point of view, what are the greatest challenges for the upcoming decades for EU-ASEAN relations, and what are those issues which might cause divergences?
Well, the biggest issue in the coming decades, we have been discussing at length already about the rise of China and the impact that China may have on ASEAN and on the EU-ASEAN relation. So further than that, we can say that EU and ASEAN do share many different views on multilateralism, on rule-based international order, on free trade, on climate change, on global threats. So there are many, many different, very important subjects where both sides share the same views and should certainly cooperate together, not only in bilateral relations, but as I said before, in multilateral fora. They should join forces to push forward their interests, their common interests, and there are many of them. On the other hand, we know that they do not always agree on democracy, on human rights, and this will remain a challenge, especially now that there's a rise in more authoritarian states, both in the EU and in ASEAN. So that will create more difficulties to find agreements on good governance and rule of law and human rights, very important topic that we didn't really mention much today yet, but which are very important for the EU, and where there is clearly disagreement, maybe not on the fundamental aspects, but on the practice of how to implement those values. And of course, there is a big difference also between the EU and ASEAN in the methods of regional integration. I mean, in the EU, we have strong institutions, we have legally binding laws or rules. We have a European Parliament, which is a co-legislator, which therefore means that the legislative branch is very powerful, while in ASEAN is totally different. We have the non-interference principle, we have the consensus building approach, we have the rule of the executive, as David was mentioning, informality in the discussion. So very different approaches to treat the problems, and that sometimes also create difficulties in finding solutions between the EU, which is in some aspects a bloc and follows very strict rules, while ASEAN is very informal and works in a very different way, very different method. So I think both sides, we have agreements on many issues that we should push forward, and we have to find ways to further discuss and agree on difficult issues. But the main challenge is certainly not the main challenge for the next decade is not between EU and ASEAN, is the role of the global power, the US and China, in this relationship, and how they will try to push each side in one or the other direction.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Mishra, how do you see this question?
Well, absolutely. Human rights issues and ideas and practice of democracy, non-traditional security threats, terrorism are going to be the key challenges for both ASEAN and the European Union. On the strategic front, I think what ASEAN would expect in next, let's say, 10 years is first, how and to what extent is European Union or members of the European Union willing to assist or support ASEAN in dealing with China, whether it is the South China Sea issue or the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm not saying that that European Union or members of it are expected to militarily support. European Union can support ASEAN at multilateral platforms in a number of other ways, and connectivity plan is just one of it. Also endorsing ASEAN's agenda and policies on regional security. ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, I think is a landmark document which can be sort of supported and endorsed, just as the Treaty on Amity and Cooperation was. So I think on that issue, it would be worth our time and attention to see whether European Union still remains a fence sitter or turns into a proactive stakeholder. that is going to be a very important challenge. I think the second one is the US-China competition is, of course, a challenge for both ASEAN and European Union at this moment. For both these regional bodies, the real challenge is whether we can convert this threat into an opportunity. And that can perhaps happen only if there is deeper and wider integration between these two regions. So inter-regional cooperation, perhaps sub-region to a particular cluster of countries within the ASEAN, the sub-regional mechanisms, and European Union if ASEAN EU doesn't suit all. Then Indo-Pacific, of course, is very important, and I see very positive signs coming from Europe. Both France and Germany have already endorsed it, and Britain sooner or later would do it. That is very important also because of the fact that ASEAN believes in institutional balancing. It doesn't want to call China an adversary and get prepared for a military conflict. But institutional soft balancing is something that ASEAN has always been practicing and requesting other countries to do. So in that context, I think supporting the idea of Indo-Pacific, engaging in greater, deeper dialogues on Indo-Pacific is something that would be very beneficial for not just for ASEAN countries, but also for other stakeholders of the Indo-Pacific region.
I'll try to be short. There are two, I think, from my point of view, there are two possibilities of serious conflict in the Southeast Asia region. The first is the South China Sea. Obviously, the EU is not a military power. Individual EU countries can contribute, but I think Xavier could correct me if I'm wrong. I think most European countries are signatories to UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and a support for the decision of the Hague Tribunal rejecting China's 9-line claims, taking the moral high ground from a legal point of view, I think is something that the EU should do, and it's with very little cost. The second area of a conflict that we don't talk about sufficiently, but which the Americans have begun to identify, is what's happening in the Mekong. The Mekong is being killed. The Mekong River is being killed by China. Okay, and this affects the livelihood of, I don't know, 20 million, I don't know how many million of people further down that river. Now, there is an area, given the EU's concern about climate change, about the environment, in which the EU could play a far more, I think, proactive role in these issues of damming, of pushing thousands and thousands of peasants off their land in order to build dams, in order to provide electricity for China, or for, in some cases, for Thailand. But this is an area which should be a subject which should be watching very, very carefully, because unlike the South China Sea, where the cause of conflict could be some kind of accident occurring, in the Mekong, as it affects the lives of so many million people, there is a deep-seated possibility of some kind of conflict in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. And now, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, nothing else is left but to deliver some kind of closing remarks. And today it is my task. So it is without a doubt that we had a very interesting set of discussions today. We managed to cover a wide range of issues covering East Asia and ASEAN relations, also about EU and ASEAN dynamics. And I would like to express my gratitude to all of our speakers of both of the panels, David Frederic Camroux, Shofan Albanna Hoyruzad, and Noel Clehan from the first panel, as well as Xavier NUTTIN, Rahul MISHRA from the second panel. And I would like to thank you all for sharing your knowledge and your invaluable insights into these exciting topics. And I also would like to thank to our co-organizer, the European Institute for Asian Studies, for their excellent job they have done. And let me tell you that during the autumn period, there will be a lot of other activities organized by the Antall József Knowledge Centre. And I would like to ask you to please follow our website as well as social media platforms for more information about the upcoming programs. We will be happy to see you at other activities. And thank you for your attention and see you next time.